And okay, well, today we will get started on this 9-part series on world religions and modern secularism. So when we think of religions today, you'll find people say, well, secular humanism is a religion. Others will say, no, it isn't. It's interesting early on that secular humanism kind of declared itself a new religion. But nowadays, most secular humanists would claim they are not a religion, where a number of theologians would say, no, secularism should be included under the heading of a religion. But we will see that in this class, we're going to say, no, it is a worldview, like religions are worldview, but on the other hand, it is not a religion by our definition of religion that we use in this class. So if you notice these images here, these are all images used by secular humanism or just humanism in general. We got atheism here in the blue circle here, but here you got kind of a radical one here with the guy trashing all religions, meaning, secular humanism doesn't need religion. Um, so we're going to get started on that, and we'll talk about the whole idea of how secular humanism is impacting the Christian worldview as we go through this presentation. All right, so the first question is secularism a worldview or a religious worldview? And so it is a worldview, and in that regard, secular humanists disagree as to whether it should be classed as a religious worldview or not. And but for the most part these days, few of them would say that they should be classed as a religion, although earlier on they might have had more secular humanists that would say, well, it is a type of a new religion. But certainly some evangelical leaders today argue that it fits the criteria of a religion, but we will see that we'll not quite agree with that. But it may be religious in the sense that, they adhere to it, with vigor, and, it is a belief system, but that does not necessarily make it the same as what we define as a religion. So Corliss Lamont, he is considered the father of modern secularism, and you see his dates there. So he's 20th century person, is the father of secular humanism. He says humanism is a philosophy, not a religion. Humanism contends that instead of God's creating the cosmos in the individualized form of human beings, giving rein to their imagination, and created the gods. So he would say religion and the idea of God or gods is a human creation, not that he self-exists. And so, but so he does. So he takes a position that they don't believe that the cosmos was created by gods, and that humans create God. And so Paul Kurtz takes position that, excuse me, secular humanism is just a philosophy built on reason and science, which does not allow for any supernatural or natural reality. So a 21st century person who held secular humanism, he also wrote a lot. I think you're reading one of his books in this class. And so, but these represent the common idea of secular humanism. You got Robert Greene Ingersoll. On the other hand, if you go back before these guys, you have Ingersoll, who says secularism is a religion that is understood. It has no mysteries, no mumbling, no priests, no ceremonies, no falsehood, no miracles, and no persecutions. And so interesting fellow, but notice he's contrasting secularism as a religion and other religions, particularly Christianity, priests, ceremonies, falsehoods, but he throws in miracles and no persecution. Now, interestingly, in the 20th century, there will be huge amounts of persecution under secular ideology. So quite different from anything seen by Christians who may have persecuted at times. Charles Potter wrote in a 1930 book, Humanism, a New Religion. So notice here's the title of a book where they were early on talking about humanism as a new religion. And these views, we'll see Potter later. He's one of the ones that develops one of the associations for secular humanism. The Humanist Manifesto, produced in 1933, religions the world over are under a necessity of coming to terms with a new condition created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience in every field of human activity. The vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism, religious humanism. So again, there early on is this tie to equating humanism or secular humanism with a belief system or being religious or a religion. John Dewey wrote in A Common Faith in 1934, here are all the elements of religious faith that shall not be confined to sect, class, or race. And so one of the things you find in common with these writers is they viewed human secularism as something that would be better for the world and bring in less wars and persecution than were seen under the time of Christianity. And of course, this will fail miserably when we get to the world wars and the rise of communism, but they didn't know about that at that time. So, so you can see that early on it was perceived as kind of a different religion, or at least an answer to religion in some religious form. By 1961, you had the Supreme Court ruling that secular humanism is a religion. They note among religions in the country which do not teach what would be generally a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others. And so this was a recognition that by the Supreme Court that secular humanism, at least for social purposes in the U.S., could be classed among religions. And they give example Taoism, Buddhism as a couple of them, although there is an element in both of those that is transcendent, which isn't there in secular humanism, but I wouldn't expect the Supreme Court to really be able to nuance that very well. But in either case, politically and socially, by the Supreme Court, you can be considered a religion. All right. So why we don't consider it a religion is because of the definition we have for religion. Worldview and religion are terms that are closely related, but they're not synonymous. Every religion can be called a worldview. However, not all worldviews are religious, depending on how religion is defined. For example, the main world religions like Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam are worldviews and religions. But while secular humanism is not a religion, it is a worldview. So remember in earlier we talked about this, what we used, our definition for what constitutes a religion. This is from Cordovan. I use his definition. I think it's one of the better ones. A religion is a system of beliefs, rituals, and practices by followers that provide value to give life meaning and coherence by directing followers to the transcendence, toward transcendence. So, and this toward transcendence is the one that differentiates humanism from religion. There is nothing transcendent in secular humanism. Everything is physical, this physical world. There's nothing outside of it. So it doesn't really fit for a definition of religion, where other religions, even ones that don't actually have a actual God, they still have a transcendent aspect to them. For example, Buddhism, there is no God. And but there is this spiritual cycle of samsara, what we call reincarnation, and karma that goes through that cycle eventually, and the humans try to get a release from that spiritual cycle, and so there is a transcendent aspect to the religion, and so we just have to keep that in mind. But anyway, so for our course, anyway, we will not be taking the view that secular humanism is actually a religion based on our particular use and definition for the course. So when we're talking about secular versus the spiritual, we want to keep in mind there's basically two worldviews. You can divide pretty much every worldview, every religion, whether it is a closed worldview or an open worldview. And we'll get into this more as we go along. But basically a closed worldview, which would be secular humanism. The material universe is all there is. Humanity evolved is solely a product of material forces. There's no spiritual dimension to it at all. Truth is relative on moral issues because they're, moral issues are ideas and values that don't come from physical aspects. Existence is by accident, and humanity is the final authority. Where open worldview, material and spiritual in the universe. So dualistic. The other view is monistic, and we'll talk about that later too. But there is both a physical nature of the world and a spiritual nature. Humanity is created in the image of God, and truth is revealed by God, and that creation is by intelligent design, and ultimately God's the authority, whether we accept it or follow it or not, it still exists. And so that's a open worldview. And we'll be contrasting these off and on, but and we'll look more deeply into what kind of closed worldview, because there's different types of open worldview and there's different types of closed worldview. And we'll see some more about that later on. But right now we want to kind of historically take a look at how thought arose, and talk about the early philosophical environment of the West. There's philosophical environment of the East too that could be considered, but we're influenced by Western thought and philosophy, and so that's where we're going to be looking at. And so I like something that Piercy said about pre-Socratic philosophers. They basically ignored the gods and the goddesses, but they didn't necessarily say they didn't exist. So you don't find true secular humanism as it is in modern times. Uh, there is some tendencies towards it in some of the Greek philosophers, but most of the time they may put emphasis, be ignoring the gods and goddesses and not placing much importance on them, but they don't seem to throw them out totally. They just kind of sequester them away or ignore them for most part. But Nancy Pearcey says this, where did the gods come from in ancient Greek mythology? Pearcey summarizes it well when she says, the essential storyline is the universe began as a divine primeval substance called chaos, an unidentified, unbound nothingness. Out of the initial state arose the first gods. The earth goddess Gaia mated with the sky god Uranus to produce the Titans. And from the mating of the two Titans came the gods of Mount Olympus, Zeus, Pallas, Athena, Poseidon, and all the rest. So here's this mythology showing, where the gods and goddesses came from, but there is this chaos, and it's the gods arose out of this chaos, and that's the background to Greek thinking. But this is going to facilitate the Greek philosophers to seek, what is that unifying force that has brought something out of the chaos, is the idea. And so they search for the original primordial principle of substance, or a first cause immanent within the cosmos, known as the arche. And so they began searching for this arche. What is the prime source or substance out of which everything came, and created this world as we know it, the cosmos. And so they basically looked at the world around them and said, well, the main elements are water, fire, and air, and earth. And they were considered by most philosophers the most basic elements of the world. And so they would focus on that for the most part. They select one of the elements and reduce everything else within a single element to arrive at a fundamental unity for the source of everything. So, for example, in this, you would have Thales of Miletus, about 624, somewhere in there, to 548 BC. And he proposed water as the primary source, because everything needs water. And so it seems that is, for him, the primary source. Anaximenes of Miletus, he proposed air. Quote is, air is God. And then you got Pythagoras. Well, there's another one here. Heraclitus of Ephesus, he proposed fire. The one that's we find interesting today mostly is Pythagoras of Samos. He proposed that nature can be represented by geometry and mathematics. God is number. That should not umber. It should be number. Number is God. So a lot of secular humanists wouldn't disagree with that in some way, saying, that numbers are part of the scientific aspect of things. So that goes back quite a ways as well. But you can see that they're looking for this arche, this central thing that brought order out of the chaos and brought this world into being. And then the two, of course, most famous philosophers are Plato and Aristotle. they have had a profound influence on Western thinking, and they continue to do so over the centuries in Platonism and Neoplatonism, and then Aristotelian thinking would go into the thinking of Christian philosophers and theologians. And throughout history, there'll be emphasis on them, and they'll use their way of thinking to understand Scripture and to explain Scripture and things like that. And so it has an influence in the world of theology, quite a bit of influence actually. And we'll talk about that some as we go along. But they maintained that the ultimate formative principle within the universe was what was called rational forms. And this is a very simplified way of looking at it. But forms are abstract concepts that make it possible to categorize the world. And where these forms come from? Plato said the forms exist in an ideal realm separate from matter. So here you have a dualism here with saying the forms exist in this ideal realm, or you could say spiritual realm, separate from matter, because you have matter over here, but they have the ideal realm, which we would also call spiritual realm of matter. And so that's where he says these forms or their ideal state is is there in the spiritual realm. Aristotle said took the position that forms inhere in matter, so they're embedded in the matter. So Aristotle, pupil of Plato, going to take a different tack. But both understood the forms as eternal, uncreated, unchangeable, universal, and self-existent, transcending the material world, but the highest being power in the cosmos. And so here you get to see that they see something separate from matter. And then so there is this dualistic understanding of the world, that there is both something eternal, uncreated, unchangeable, universals, and but it transcends the material world. And so you can see why this was appealing to Christian theologians and philosophers, that there is in Christian teaching, God did create matter, but there is also a spiritual dimension to the world and to humanity. So Aristotle said, here must surely be the divine, and this must be the first and most dominant principle, the arche. And the preeminent form is the form of the good. To see good involves a conversion of turning of the soul from darkness to light. And then Plato says the preeminent form is the form of the good. To see good involves a conversion, turning the soul from darkness to light. And the true philosopher is the person who contemplates this divine order. And Percy points this out in her book that we looked at. It's a redundant statement. I think I was supposed to delete that part. All right, so here you're getting into the early philosophers, Greek philosophers, that will impact Christian thinking a lot. So Plato and Aristotle will be two of the big ones, of course. And so among Greek philosophers, there were those who were very skeptic. They were skeptical of the gods and goddess idea of gods and goddesses. And so they weren't so much atheistic as they were skeptical or maybe deistic, and that the gods were not there, but they weren't concerned for humanity, which is, if you really read the mythology, the gods and goddesses aren't really concerned with humanity. And so you have that aspect like deistic, but they also just skeptical about gods at all being very useful. Although for the most part, you don't see them just totally rejecting the idea of gods outright. So Democritus is one of the early ones. He's Greek father of materialism in the West. Yeah, there's no trace of a belief in any afterlife in his work. He does say those in Hades he refers to as constituents of the soul, as atoms that dissolve upon death. And so he seems to be the one that gets the closest to, you know, just being atheistic in his thought that there are no gods. But I don't think he even himself totally throws them out. Epicurus, he was influenced by Democritus. He held a materialist view and rejected any afterlife, while further claiming the gods were also uninterested in human affairs. So notice, he doesn't throw out the gods. And so that seems to be the general tone of these philosophers that they were doing philosophy, trying to figure out what the arche is, that ultimate reality. But gods and goddesses, all right, but not useful as far as they were concerned. Then you got Zeno of Citium, founder of Stoicism. This is helpful because we run into Stoicism in New Testament when Paul runs into Stoics and Epicureans, and so we have to realize their philosophy was around, even though it goes back, 344 BC is his life to 262. The Stoic schools continued, and no doubt there was a Stoic school in Tarsus where Paul grew up, and because Tarsus was at that time more famous than Athens for its philosophical schools and philosophical teachings that went on there. So Apostle Paul would have been very familiar with Stoicism and Epicureanism and a bunch of the others from his background, no doubt. He would say God is a corporal entity, though not one made of everyday matter. Epicureans thought the gods were too busy being happy to be bothered by governing the universe. So they they set the gods and goddesses over on one side and saying they're having their fun and enjoying themselves, but they're really not involved in the world. If you believe the mythology, they just kind of play with the human beings and utilize them for their amusement. Stoic God is immanent throughout the whole creation and directs its development in every detail. The entire universe is a living thing, and God is a life force behind it, enlivening, and moving and directing it by its presence throughout. And so you got this life force, and that's throughout all creation, which is developing it, going on. You'll find this often in modern day pantheism, similar type of view, but that you see it here in Stoicism. Stoics insist that only bodies are capable of causing anything. This guarantees that the cosmic life force must be conceived as somehow corporal. So now, what all that exactly means, there is something out there that is directing things, but it's just this vague source of power. So that brings us to the end of this section. We're going to pick up next on the first century and what it was like in that time period, and the effects of Greek thinking. We'll be moving into that area next. So let me stop